Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story called Against Time by Antonio Tabucchi. Now this short story is very interesting and it is Italian. So basically what happened is that it's about this man on a plane to Crete, and he looks through this weekend magazine of newspaper which was offered by a flight attendant. And he finds himself so drawn into a series of photos depicting horrors of the past century that when he lands in Crete, he decides to change the course of his life. Now, Against Time is honestly not a very popular short story at all, but you can definitely see Tabucchi's art in this story, because the majority of his stories feature older men who are looking back at their lives and they're trying to understand who they were or who they've become. And basically, some of the stories also show how they try to find themselves. And so, most stories of his involve dramatic changes, just like Against Time in the very end does. And you can see how our main character has a complete transformation in this story, and you can see, as in the beginning of the story and at the end of his story, how much he's changed. Now, I also want you guys to be able to have an opinion of the story or think of a theme yourself. So, I'm going to tell you a couple facts about the author. Antonio Tabucchi was born on September 24th, 1943 and died on March 25th, 2012. He was an Italian writer and academic, and a scholar of Portuguese literature. Deeply in love with Portugal, he was an expert critic and translator of the works of the writer Fernando Pessoa, from whom he drew a lot of inspiration from. Now, Tabucchi's interest in Portugal, Portuguese food, the poet Pessoa, and India crop up repeatedly in his work, as do certain periods and certain types. Over the course of his career, he won France's Médicis Prize for Indian Nocturne, the Italian Pen Prize for Requiem, and the Artesian European Literature for Peria de Cloris. His first important novel was Indian Nocturne, which was published in 1948 and became the basis of the 1989 film directed by Alain Corneau. Now, Indian Nocturne was basically about this guy who decides to travel India and find his long-lost best friend. And you can tell in the story that he's also, in a way, finding himself. In 1994, he released Gli Ottimi Triginori di Fernando Pessoa, as well as the novel that brought him the most recognition, Soistine Pieria. Against Time was first published in 2009. Now, before we start the story, I would like to apologize if I have said any names or books or places incorrectly. I'm sure I have. But since Antonio Tabucchi was an Italian writer, most of his works were written in Italian. So I am not going to be able to pronounce everything correctly. But Against Time was translated, so most of the words that I pronounced there should be correct. Without further ado, let's start the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which story you would like to hear next. Against Time by Antonio Tabucchi. Translated by Martha Cooley and Antonio Romano. It had gone like this. The man had boarded at an Italian airport because everything began in Italy, and whether it was Milan or Rome was secondary. What matters is that it was an Italian airport where you could take a direct flight to Athens, and from there, after a brief stopover, a connecting flight to Crete on Aegean Airlines. So in Italy, he'd taken a flight that let him connect in Athens for Crete at around 2 in the afternoon. He'd seen it on the Greek company schedule, which meant that this man had arrived in Crete at around 3:30 in the afternoon. The airport of departure is not so important, though, in the story of the person who lived that story. It's the morning of any day at the end of April 2008. A splendid day, almost like summer, which is not an insignificant detail, because the man taking the flight, meticulous as he was, gave considerable importance to the weather and would watch a satellite channel dedicated to the meteorology around the world, and the weather in Crete he had seen was really splendid. 29 degrees Celsius during the day, clear sky, humidity within normal limits, good seaside weather, ideal for lying on one of the white beaches described in his guide, for bathing in the blue sea and enjoying a well-deserved vacation. Because this was also the reason for the journey of that man who was going to live that story, a vacation. And in fact, that's what he thought, sitting in the waiting lounge for international flights at Rome Fiumicino, waiting for the boarding calls for Athens. And here he is, finally on the plane, comfortably installed in business class. It's a paid trip, as will be seen later, reassured by the courtesies of the flight attendants. His age is difficult to determine, even for the person who knew the story that the man was living. Let's say he was between 50 and 60 years old, lean, robust, healthy-looking, salt and pepper hair, fine blonde mustache, plastic glasses for far-sightedness hung from his neck. His work. On this point, too, the person who knew his story was somewhat uncertain. He could be a manager of a multinational, one of those anonymous businessmen who spend their lives in an office and whose merit is one day acknowledged by headquarters. But he could also be a marine biologist, one of those researchers who observe seaweed and microorganisms under a microscope without leaving their laboratory, and so can assert that the Mediterranean will become a tropical sea, as perhaps it was millions of years ago. Yet this hypothesis also struck him as not very satisfying. Biologists who study the sea don't always remain shut up in their laboratory. They wander beaches and rocks, perhaps they dive, they perform their own surveys, and that passenger dozing in his business class seat on a flight to Athens didn't actually look like a marine biologist. Maybe on weekends he went to the gym to keep fit, nothing else. But if he really did go to the gym, then why did he go? To what end did he maintain his body, stay so young-looking? There was really no reason. It had been over for quite a while with the woman he'd considered his life companion. He didn't have another companion or lover. He lived alone, stayed away from the serious commitments, apart from some rare adventures that can happen to everybody. Perhaps the most credible hypothesis was that he was a naturalist, a modern follower of Linnaeus, and he was going to a convention in Crete, along with other experts on medicinal herbs and plants abundant in Crete. Because one thing was certain, he was going to a convention of fellow researchers. His was a journey that rewarded a lifetime of work and commitment. The convention was taking place in the city of Rhetimno. He'd be in a hotel made of bungalows a few kilometers from Rhetimno, and a car service would shuttle him in the afternoons, but he'd have mornings to himself. The man woke up, pulled out the guide from his carry-on, and looked for his hotel. What he found was reassuring. 2 restaurants, a pool, room service. The hotel had closed for the winter and had only reopened in mid-April, and this meant very few tourists would be there. The usual clients, the northern Europeans thirsty for sunlight, as the guide described them, were still in their little boreal houses. The pleasant voice from the loudspeaker asked everyone to buckle their seatbelts. They'd begun the descent to Athens and would land in about 20 minutes. The man closed the folding tray table and put his seat upright, replaced the guide in his carry-on, and from the pocket of the seat in front of him pulled out the newspaper that the flight attendant had distributed, to which he paid no attention. It was a newspaper with many full-color supplements, the usual weekend ones, the economics financial supplement, the sports supplement, the interior design supplement, and the weekend magazine. He skipped all the supplements and opened the magazine. On the cover, in black and white, was the picture of the atomic bomb's mushroom cloud, with the title, "The Great Images of Our Time." He began leafing through somewhat reluctantly. First came by an ad by two fashion designers showing a young man naked to the waist, which at first he thought was a great image of our time, but then there was the first true image of our time, the stone facade of a house in Hiroshima, where the heat from the atomic bomb had liquefied a man, leaving only the imprint of his shadow. He'd never seen this image and was astonished by it, feeling a kind of remorse. That thing had happened more than 60 years before. How was it possible he'd never seen it? The shadow on the stone was a silhouette, and in this profile he thought he could see his friend Ferruccio, who for no apparent reason on the New Year's Eve of 1999, shortly before midnight, had thrown himself from the 10th floor of the building onto Via Cavour. Was it possible that the profile of Ferruccio, squashed into the soil on 31st of December in 1999, looked like the profile absorbed by stone in a Japanese city in 1945? The idea was absurd, yet that's what passed through his mind in all its absurdity. He kept rifling the magazine, and meanwhile his heart began beating erratically. 1, 2, pause, 3, 1, pause, 2, 3, 1, pause, 2, 3. The so-called extrasystoles. Nothing pathological. The cardiologist had reassured him after an entire day of testing, only a matter of anxiety. But why now? It couldn't be those images provoking his emotions. They were far-away things. That naked girl, arms raised, who was running towards the camera in an apocalyptic landscape. He'd seen this image more than once, and it hadn't made such a violent impression. And yet it now produced him in an intense turmoil. He turned the page. There was a man on his knees, palms together at the edge of a pit, a kid sadistically pointing a gun at his temple. "Khmer Rouge," said the caption. To reassure himself, he made himself think that these things were also from faraway places and distant times. But the thought wasn't enough. A strange form of emotion, almost a thought, was telling him the opposite, that the atrocity had happened yesterday. It had happened just that morning, while he was on this flight, and by sorcery had imprinted on the page he was looking at. The voice over the loudspeaker stated that the landing would be delayed by 15 minutes due to air traffic, and meanwhile, passengers should enjoy the view. The plane traced a wide curve, banking to the right. From the little window opposite, he could glance the blue of the ocean, while in his own, the white city of Athens was framed, with a green spot in the middle, no doubt a park, and then the Acropolis. He could see the Acropolis perfectly, and the Parthenon. His palms were damp with sweat. He asked himself if it weren't a sort of panic provoked by the plane going round in circles, and meanwhile he looked at the photo of a stadium where policemen in riot gear pointed a submachine guns at a bunch of barefooted men. Under it was written, Santiago de Chile, 1973. And on the opposite page was a photo that seemed a montage, surely retouched. It couldn't be real. He'd never seen it. On the balcony of a 19th century palazzo was Pope John Paul II, next to a general in uniform. The Pope was without doubt the Pope, and the general was without doubt Pinochet, with the hair full of brilliantine, that chubby face, that little mustache, and the Ray-Ban sunglasses. The caption had said, His Holiness the Pope on his official visit to Chile. April 1987. He began quickly leafing through the magazine, as though anxious to get to the end, barely looking at the photographs, but he had to stop at one of them. It showed a kid with his back turned to a police van, his arms raised as though his beloved soccer team had scored a goal, but looking closer you could see he was falling backward. Something stronger than he had struck him. On it was written, Genoa, July 2001. Meeting of the 8 richest countries in the world. The 8 richest countries in the world. The phrase provoked him, a strange sensation, like something that is at once understandable and absurd, because it was understandable and yet absurd. Every photo was on a silvery page as though it were Christmas, with a date in big letters. He'd arrived at 2004, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to see the next picture. Was it possible the plane was still going around circles? He turned the page. It showed a naked body collapsed on the ground. A man, apparently, though in the photo they had blurred the pubic area. A soldier in camouflage extended a leg towards the body, as though he were kicking a garbage can. The dog he held on a leash was trying to bite a leg. The muscles of the animal were taut, as the cord that held it. In the other hand, the soldier held a cigarette. The caption read, Abu Ghraib Prison, Iraq, 2004. After that, he arrived at the year he found himself in now. The year of our Lord, 2008. That is, he found himself in sync. That's what he thought, even if he didn't know with what, but in sync. He couldn't tell what image he was in sync with, but he didn't turn the page. Meanwhile, the plane was finally landing. The landing strip was running beneath him, with the intermittent white bands blurring to a single band. He'd arrived. Venizelos Airport looked brand new. Surely they'd built it for the Olympic Games. He was happy with himself for being able to reach the boarding gate for Crete without reading the signs in English. The Greek he'd learned at school was still useful, curiously. When he landed at the Hania airport at first, he didn't realize he'd reached his destination. During the brief flight from Athens to Crete, a little less than an hour, he'd fallen fast asleep, forgetting everything, it seemed, even himself. To such a degree that when he came down the airplane staircase into that African light, he asked himself where he was, why he was there, and even who he was. And in that amazement at nothing, he even felt happy. His suitcase wasn't long in arriving on the conveyor belt. Just beyond the boarding gates were at the car rental offices. He couldn't remember the instructions. Hertz or Avis? It was one or the other. Fortunately, he guessed right. Along with the car keys, they gave him a good map of Crete, a copy of the program of the convention, his hotel reservation, and the route to the tourist village, where the convention goers were lodged, which now he knew by heart, because he'd studied and restudied it in his guide, nicely furnished with road maps. From the airport, you went down straight to the coast. You had to go that way unless you wanted to reach the Marathi beaches. Then you turned left. Otherwise, you wound up west, and he was going east, towards Heraklion. You passed in front of the Hotel Doma, went along Venizelos, and followed the green signs that meant highway, though it was actually a coastal freeway. You exited shortly after Georgopolis, a tourist spot to avoid, and followed the directions for the hotel beach resort. It was easy. The car, a black Volkswagen parked in the sun, was boiling, but he let it cool down a little by leaving the doors open. Entered it as though he were late for an appointment, but he wasn't late, and he didn't have any appointments. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He'd get to the hotel in a little more than an hour. The convention wouldn't start till the evening of the following day. with an official banquet. He had more than 24 hours of freedom. What was the hurry? No hurry. After a few kilometers, a tourist sign indicated the grave of Venizelos, a few hundred meters from the main road. He decided to take a short break to freshen up before the drive. Next to the entrance to the monument was an ice cream shop with a large open terrace overlooking the little town. He settled himself at a table, ordered a Turkish coffee and a lemon sorbet. The town he saw had been Venetian and then Turkish. It was nice and of an almost blinding white. Now he was feeling really good, with an unusual energy. The disquiet he'd felt on the plane had completely vanished. He checked the road map. To get to the freeway to Erkleien, he could pass through the town or go around the Gulf of Sauda a few kilometers more. He chose the second route. The Gulf from above was beautiful, and the sea intensely azure. The descent from the hill to Sauda was pleasant beyond the low vegetation and the rooftops of some houses. He could see little coves of white sand. A strong urge to swim came over him. He turned off the air conditioning and lowered the window to feel the warm air smelling of the sea on his face. He passed the industrial port and the residential zone and arrived at the intersection where, turning to the left, the road merged with the coastal highway to Erkleien. He put on his left blinker and stopped. A car behind him beeped for him to go. There was no oncoming traffic. He didn't move, just let the car pass him, then signaled right and went in the opposite direction, where a sign said, Mornies. And now we're following him, the unknown character who'd arrived in Crete to reach a pleasant seaside local, who at a certain moment abruptly, for a reason also unknown, took a road towards the mountains. The man proceeded till Mornes, drove through the village without knowing where he was going, though as if he did. Actually, he wasn't thinking, just driving. He knew he was headed south. The sun, still high, was already behind him. Since he'd changed direction, the sensation of the lightness had returned, which he briefly felt at the table at the ice cream shop, looking down on the broad horizon. An unusual lightness, and with it an energy he no longer recalled, as though he were young again, a sort of light euphoria, almost a happiness. He'd arrived at a village called Fornes, drove through a town confidently, as though he already knew the way, stopped at a crossroads. The main road went to the right. He took the secondary road with a sign that said, Livka Ori, the White Mountains. He drove on calmly. The sensation of well-being was turning into a sort of cheerfulness. A Mozart aria came to mind, and he felt he could reproduce its notes. He began whistling them with amazing ease, but then went hopelessly out of tune in a couple passages, which made him laugh. The road slipped into the rugged canyons of a mountain. They were beautiful and wild places. The car went along a narrow asphalt road, bordering the bed of a dry creek. At a certain point, the creek bed disappeared among the rocks, and the asphalt ended in a dirt road, and a barren plain among inhospitable mountains. Meanwhile, the light was fading, but he kept on going as though he already knew the way, like someone was obeying an old memory or an order received in a dream. And at a certain point he saw a crooked tin sign riddled with holes as though from gunshots or from time, and the sign said, Monastery. He followed it as though he had been expecting it all along. When he came to a tiny monastery, its roof in ruins, he realized he'd arrived. Went down. The dilapidated door of those ruins sagged inward. He figured no one was there any longer. A beehive under the little portico seemed the only housekeeper. He went down and waited as if he had an appointment. It was almost dark. Then, at the door, a monk appeared. He was very old and moved with difficulty, and he had the look of an anchorite, with his hair down to his shoulders and yellowish beard. "What do you want?" he asked in Greek. "Do you know Italian?" answered the traveler. The old man nodded. "A little," he murmured. "I've come to change places with you," said the man. So it'd been like this, and no other conclusion was possible, because that story didn't call for any other possible conclusions. But the person who knew the story was aware that he couldn't let it conclude this way, and at this point he made a leap in time. And thanks to one of those leaps in time that are possible only in the imagination, things landed in the future with regard to that month of April of 2008. How many years ahead, no one knows, and that person who knew the story remained vague. 20 years, for instance, which in the lifetime of a man is a lot. But if in 2008 a man of 60 still had all of his energy, in 2028 he'd be an old man, his body worn out by time. And so the person who knew the story imagined it continued like this. And so let's accept that we're in 2028, as the person who knew the story had wanted, and had imagined it would continue. At this point, the person who imagined how the story would continue saw two young people, a guy and a girl wearing leather shorts and trekking boots, who were hiking in the mountains of Crete. The girl said to her companion, "I think that old guide you found in your father's library doesn't make any sense. By now, the monastery will be a pile of stones full of lizards. Why don't we just head towards the sea?" And the guy responded, "I think you're right." But just as he said this, she replied, "No, let's keep on going for a bit. You never know." And in fact, it was enough to walk around the rugged red hailstone that cut through the countryside, and there it was, the monastery, or rather the ruins of the monastery, and the two of them approached. A wind blew in from the canyons, raising the dust. The monastery's door had collapsed. Wasps' nest defended that empty cave. The two of them had already turned backs on that gloom when they heard a voice. In the empty space of the door stood a man. He was very old, looked dreadful, with a long white beard to his chest, and hair down to his shoulders. "Ooh," called the voice. Nothing else. The couple stood still. The man asked, "Do you understand Italian?" They didn't respond. "What happened in 2008? asked the old man. The two young people looked at each other. They didn't have the courage to exchange a word. "Do you have photographs?" asked the old man. "What happened in 2008? Then he gestured for them to go away, though perhaps he was brushing away the wasps that whirled around the portico, and he returned to the dark of his cave. The man who knew the story was aware that it couldn't finish in any other way. Before writing his stories, he loved telling them to himself. And he'd tell himself so perfectly in such detail, word by word, that one might say they were written in his memory. He'd tell them to himself, preferably late in the evening in the solitude of that big empty house, or on those nights where he couldn't sleep, those nights in which insomnia yielded nothing but imagination. Not much, yet imagination gave him a reality so alive that it seemed more real than the reality he was living. But the most difficult thing wasn't telling to himself his stories. That was the easy part. It was as though he'd see the words of the stories, he told himself, written on the dark screen of his room, when fantasy would keep his eyes wide open. And that one story, which he told himself in this way so many times, seemed to him an already printed book, one that was very easy to express mentally, but very difficult to write, with the letters of the alphabet necessary for the thought to be made concrete and visible. It was as if he were lacking the principle of reality to write his story, and in order to live the effective reality of what was real within him, yet unable to become truly real, he'd chosen this place. The trip was planned in fine detail. He landed at the Hanya airport, got his luggage, went into the Hearth's office, picked up the car keys. 3 days, the clerk asked, astonished. What's so strange about it? He said. No one comes to Crete on vacation for 3 days, the clerk replied, smiling. I have a long weekend, he responded. It's enough for what I have to do. The light in Crete was beautiful. It wasn't Mediterranean, but African. He'd reached the beach resort in an hour and a half, at most 2. Even going slowly, he'd arrived there around 6, a shower, and he'd start writing immediately. The hotel restaurant was open till 11. It was Thursday evening, he counted. All of Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 3 full days. They'd be enough. In his head, everything was already written. Why he turned left at that light, he couldn't say. The pylons of the freeway were clearly visible, another 400 or 500 meters, and he'd be at the coastal freeway to Irkline. But instead, he turned left, where a little blue sign indicated an unknown place. He thought he'd already been there, for in a moment he saw everything. A tree-lined street with a few houses, a plain square with an ugly monument, a ledge of rocks, a mountain. It was a flash of lighting. The strange thing which medical science can't explain, he told himself. They call it déjà vu, already seen. It had never happened to him before. But the explanation he gave himself didn't reassure him, because the already seen endured. It was already stronger than what he was seeing, like a membrane enveloping the surrounding reality. The trees, the mountains, the evening shadows, even the air he was breathing. He felt overcome by vertigo and was afraid of being sucked into it, but only for a moment, because as it expanded, that sensation went through a strange metamorphosis, like a glove turning inside out and bringing forth the hand it covered. Everything changed perspective. In a flash, he felt the euphoria of discovery, a subtle nausea, a mortal melancholy, but also a sense of infinite liberation, as when we finally understand something we'd known all along and didn't want to know. It wasn't the already seen that was swallowing him in a never-lived past. He insisted he was capturing it in a future yet to be lived. As he drove among the olive trees that on a little road taking him towards the mountains, he knew that at a certain point he'd find a rusty old sign, full of holes, on it which was written, Monastery, and that he would follow it. Now everything was clear. The end.